The autumn sun was just breaking through the thick London clouds when Staff Sergeant Jake Thompson stepped off the red double-decker bus near Buckingham Palace. His cowboy boots clicked against the wet pavement as he adjusted his leather jacket and looked around at the bustling crowd. After 18 months of sleeping on cots in dusty Afghan compounds, the sight of normal people going about their daily lives still felt surreal. Jake had been planning this trip for what felt like forever. Every time his unit got mail callback at base, his younger sister would send him postcards of London landmarks with little notes scribbled on the back. "You better visit Big Ben when you get back," she'd write, or "I bet the guards at the palace are shorter than you." Those little cards had kept him going through some pretty rough nights, and now here he was, finally making good on his promise to see the sights. The smell of fresh coffee and pastries drifted from a nearby cafe, mixing with the crisp October air. Jake's stomach rumbled, reminding him that airplane food didn't really count as a proper meal. But first, he wanted to see what all the fuss was about with this changing of the guard ceremony. He'd heard other Marines talking about it during their downtime, describing it as something every American soldier should witness at least once. As he walked toward the palace gates, Jake couldn't help but notice how different everything felt compared to the military bases he was used to. Here, families pushed strollers while kids ran ahead pointing at pigeons. Elderly couples sat on benches sharing newspapers and thermoses of tea. Street performers played music on corners while tourists dropped coins into their cases. It was the kind of peaceful scene that reminded him why he'd chosen to serve in the first place. The crowd was already 3 or 4 people deep along the palace railings, and Jake had to work his way through to get a decent view. He found himself standing next to a family from Australia who were excitedly comparing their guidebook to the real thing in front of them. The mother kept adjusting her camera settings while the father pointed out architectural details to their teenage daughter, who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. "First time seeing the guards?" The Australian man asked Jake, noticing his obvious American accent when he excused himself to move closer to the fence. "Yeah, first time in London." "Actually," Jake replied, running a hand through his short-cropped hair, "heard this was something worth seeing." "Oh, mate, it's quite the show. Very formal, very precise. Reminds me a bit of our own military ceremonies back home, but with more history, you know." Jake nodded, understanding exactly what the man meant. There was something about military tradition that transcended borders. Whether you were watching Marines at attention in Quantico or guards at Buckingham Palace, there was a shared respect for the discipline and dedication it represented. The crowd continued to grow around them, with people jostling for better positions and holding up phones and cameras. Jake noticed several tour groups had gathered, their guides speaking in multiple languages. While pointing out various features of the palace and explaining the significance of the ceremony they were about to witness, a street vendor nearby was selling Union Jack flags and postcards, calling out to tourists in heavily accented English, "Get your souvenirs here. Pictures of the Queen. Royal family memorabilia." The commercialization felt a bit odd to Jake, but he supposed every tourist destination had its share of opportunistic sellers. As they waited, Jake found himself studying the palace architecture, noting the impressive stonework and the intricate details carved into the facade. It was the kind of building that had probably stood for centuries, witnessing countless historical moments. He tried to imagine all the important figures who had walked through those gates over the years, the decisions made within those walls that had shaped world events. The autumn air was getting cooler, and Jake zipped up his jacket a bit higher. He'd gotten used to the desert heat of Afghanistan, where the sun would beat down relentlessly during the day. This London weather was a welcome change, even if the dampness in the air reminded him it could start raining at any moment. A commotion near the palace gates caught everyone's attention. The crowd began to quiet down and press forward as uniformed guards became visible in the distance. Camera phones went up and people started positioning themselves for the best shots. Jake found himself getting caught up in the excitement despite himself. "Here they come," whispered the Australian woman next to him. Adjusting her camera lens with practiced precision, Jake watched as the first guards appeared, their red uniforms bright against the gray stone of the palace. Even from a distance, Their bearing was unmistakably military. The way they moved, the precision of their steps, the way they held their rifles, it all spoke to years of training and discipline that Jake recognized from his own military experience. The crowd fell into an almost reverent silence as the guards approached. Even the street vendors stopped their calling to watch the ceremony unfold. There was something about the moment that demanded respect. Regardless of whether you understood all the historical significance behind it, Jake found himself straightening up unconsciously, his own military training kicking in as he watched fellow servicemen perform their duties. It didn't matter that they wore different uniforms or served different countries. There was an immediate recognition, a professional appreciation for what they were witnessing. The guards were getting closer now, and Jake could make out individual faces beneath the tall black hats they wore. They looked young, probably not much different in age from the Marines in his own unit back home. He wondered what their training was like, how long they'd been serving, whether they enjoyed the ceremonial aspects of their duties or preferred more traditional military roles. As the ceremony was about to begin in earnest, Jake settled in to watch, unaware that in just a few minutes his peaceful London vacation would take a dramatic turn that would change everything. The morning sun continued to filter through the clouds, casting long shadows across the palace courtyard as hundreds of tourists prepared to witness what they thought would be a routine changing of the guard. Little did anyone know that this particular ceremony would become anything but routine, and that Jake's military instincts, honed through months of combat and training, were about to be put to the test in a way he never could have imagined when he first stepped off that London bus. The ceremony was in full swing now, and Jake found himself mesmerized by the precision of it all. The guards moved like clockwork, each step perfectly timed, their red uniforms creating a striking contrast against the gray stone of the palace. The crowd around him had fallen into an almost hypnotic silence, broken only by the occasional click of a camera or whispered comment. Jake had seen plenty of military ceremonies during his time in the Marines, but there was something uniquely captivating about this British tradition. The guards carried themselves with a dignity that spoke of centuries of history, their movements sharp and deliberate. He could tell these weren't just ceremonial soldiers playing dress-up. These were real military men who took their duties seriously. As he watched, Jake's eyes began to focus on individual guards rather than the formation as a whole. It was a habit he'd developed during his deployments, always scanning for details that others might miss. In Afghanistan, that kind of attention could mean the difference between life and death. Here, in peaceful London, it was just second nature. One guard in particular caught his attention. The young man was positioned slightly to the left of the main formation, standing at rigid attention with his rifle held perfectly straight. But something seemed off. Jake couldn't put his finger on it at first, but his instincts were telling him to keep watching. The guard appeared to be fighting something. His jaw was clenched tight, and Jake could see tiny beads of sweat forming on his forehead despite the cool October air. The man's breathing seemed slightly labored, though he was trying his best to hide it behind the stoic mask that his position required. Jake had seen this before. During basic training, he'd watched fellow recruits struggle through long inspections and formations in the blazing sun. Some guys just weren't built for standing motionless for extended periods, especially when wearing heavy uniforms and carrying equipment, but this was London in autumn, not the desert. The weather wasn't even that warm. The Australian family next to Jake was busy taking photos, completely absorbed in capturing the perfect shot. The father was explaining to his daughter how the guards were trained never to move or react, no matter what happened around them. "They're like statues," he was saying. "Nothing breaks their concentration." But Jake wasn't listening to the tourist commentary anymore. His full attention was on the struggling guard, who was now swaying almost imperceptibly. It was so slight that probably no one else in the crowd would notice, but Jake's trained eye caught every micro-movement. The guard's face was getting paler by the minute. What had started as a light sheen of sweat was now clearly visible droplets rolling down his temples. His grip on his rifle was beginning to loosen slightly. Though he was fighting hard to maintain his military bearing, Jake felt his own heart rate starting to increase. This wasn't just fatigue or nerves. This looked like genuine medical distress. He'd seen guys go down from heat exhaustion, dehydration, and sheer physical stress during training. The signs were all there, written clearly across the young guard's increasingly pale face. The crowd continued to watch and photograph, completely unaware of the drama unfolding right in front of them. Tour guides kept up their running commentary about royal traditions and historical significance. Children pointed excitedly at the colorful uniforms. Everyone was having a wonderful time witnessing this piece of living history, but Jake's military instincts were screaming at him now. The guard was in trouble. Real trouble. And no one else seemed to notice or care. He looked around desperately for someone in authority, a police officer, a palace guard, anyone who might be able to help. But all the security personnel seemed focused on crowd control and general observation. They weren't looking for medical emergencies among their own people. The guard's swaying was becoming more pronounced now. His face had gone from pale to an alarming gray color, and Jake could see his legs beginning to tremble with the effort of staying upright. The rifle in his hands was wobbling slightly, though the young man was using every ounce of his remaining strength. To maintain his position, Jake's mind raced through his options. He could try to get the attention of a police officer, but that would take time this guard clearly didn't have. He could shout a warning, but that would likely cause panic in the crowd and might not even be heard over the general noise of hundreds of tourists. The Australian woman next to him was still snapping photos enthusiastically. "Oh, this is perfect," she was saying to her husband. "The lighting is just right, and you can see their faces so clearly." If only she knew that one of those faces was showing clear signs of medical distress, Jake thought grimly. The tourists saw what they expected to see, a perfect ceremonial display. Not human beings struggling with very real physical limitations. The guard's condition was deteriorating rapidly now. His breathing had become shallow and rapid, and Jake could see him fighting to stay conscious. The young man's training was the only thing keeping him on his feet, but even the best training had its limits. When the body started shutting down, Jake had been in situations where split-second decisions meant everything. In Afghanistan, hesitation could get people killed. But this wasn't a war zone. This was a tourist attraction in one of the world's most civilized cities. The rules were different here. Or were they? The guard's knees buckled slightly, and he caught himself just in time. But Jake could see it was only a matter of seconds now before the young man went down completely. And when he fell, he'd be falling onto concrete, possibly with a loaded rifle, in front of hundreds of people, including small children. Jake's training kicked into overdrive. Every instinct told him to act, to help a fellow serviceman in distress. But his rational mind reminded him of where he was, behind barriers at a royal ceremony, surrounded by armed security. In a foreign country where his actions could be seriously misunderstood, the crowd pressed closer around him, everyone trying to get the perfect view of the ceremony. Camera phones were held high, recording every moment for social media posts and family memories. No one had any idea they were about to witness something far more dramatic than a routine changing of the guard. Jake watched in growing alarm as the guard's eyes began to lose focus. The young man was fighting valiantly, but it was a losing battle against whatever was happening to his body. In just a few more seconds, he was going to collapse, and there wasn't going to be anyone close enough to help him. That's when Jake made his decision. Military brotherhood didn't recognize national boundaries or ceremonial protocols. A soldier was in trouble, and he was the only one in position to help. Everything else, the barriers, the security, the potential consequences, became secondary to that. Basic human instinct to protect a fellow warrior. Jake took a deep breath and prepared to act, knowing full well that the next few seconds would change everything about his peaceful London vacation. Jake didn't have time to think anymore. The guard's legs were giving out, and his rifle was starting to slip from his grip. In that split second, every fiber of Jake's being switched into combat mode. He'd spent months in Afghanistan where hesitation meant death, where the difference between acting and thinking could determine who went home and who didn't. The metal barrier in front of him might as well have been made of paper. Jake planted his hands on top and vaulted over it in one smooth motion, his cowboy boots hitting the pavement on the other side with a solid thud. The Australian family next to where he'd been standing gasped in shock, the woman's camera nearly slipping from her hands. "Hey, what are you doing?" Someone shouted from the crowd behind him. Jake ignored the voices. His focus was laser-sharp on the collapsing guard, who was now swaying dangerously forward. The young man's face had gone completely white and his eyes were rolling back. Jake could see it happening in slow motion, the guard's knees buckling, his body starting to pitch forward toward the unforgiving concrete. The distance between them felt like miles, but Jake covered it in 3 quick strides. His military training had taught him to move fast when lives were on the line, and right now, that's exactly what this was. Just as the guard's body went completely limp, Jake was there. He caught the falling soldier under his arms, breaking what would have been a devastating fall onto the stone pavement. The guard's ceremonial rifle clattered against Jake's chest, but he managed to keep it from hitting the ground. The weight of the unconscious man was more than Jake had expected. All that ceremonial gear was surprisingly heavy. For a moment, time seemed completely frozen. Jake found himself holding an unconscious British Royal Guard in the middle of what was supposed to be a perfectly choreographed ceremony. Around them, the other guards continued their formation, their training keeping them focused despite the unexpected disruption happening just feet away. The crowd erupted into chaos. People started screaming, though Jake couldn't tell if it was from fear or excitement. Camera phones swiveled in his direction, hundreds of them all recording this unprecedented moment. Flashbulbs went off like strobe lights, creating a disorienting display that made the whole scene feel surreal. "Security breach! Security breach!" Someone was shouting over a radio. Jake could hear heavy footsteps running toward them from multiple directions. He looked down at the guard in his arms. The young man was breathing, but barely conscious. His skin felt clammy and cold, classic signs of shock or severe dehydration. Jake had seen this condition before in the desert when guys pushed themselves too hard without enough water or rest. "It's okay, buddy," Jake whispered to the semi-conscious guard. "I've got you. You're going to be fine." The first security officer reached them within seconds, his hand already on his weapon. "Step away from the guard immediately," he shouted, his voice cutting through the crowd noise. Jake looked up calmly, keeping his hands visible while still supporting the injured soldier. "I'm a U.S. Marine," he called out clearly. "This man needs medical attention." He collapsed from what looks like dehydration. More security personnel were arriving by the second, forming a protective circle around Jake and the fallen guard. Their radios crackled with urgent communications, and Jake could see the tension in their faces. From their perspective, this probably looked like either an attack or some kind of elaborate prank gone wrong. "Put the guard down and step back with your hands up," another officer commanded, his voice sharp with authority. "He's unconscious," Jake replied, not moving. "If I let go of him, he'll hit the concrete. We need medical help here, not more guns." The crowd behind the barriers was going absolutely wild. People were pushing and shoving to get better views, parents were grabbing their children, and tour guides were frantically trying to figure out what to tell their groups. The whole scene had transformed from a peaceful ceremony into what looked like a major security incident. Jake could hear sirens in the distance, ambulance, police, or both. The sound was getting closer, which was good news for the guard who was still unconscious in his arms. The young man's breathing was shallow but steady, and his color was starting to improve slightly now that he wasn't fighting to stay upright. "American, what's your name and identification?" demanded a senior-looking officer who had just arrived on scene. "Staff Sergeant Jake Thompson, United States Marine Corps." Jake responded immediately, using his command voice that cut through all the noise and confusion. "ID is in my back pocket." This guard collapsed from medical distress. I was in position to help, so I helped. The officer studied Jake's face carefully, probably trying to determine if he was dealing with a terrorist, a crazy tourist, or exactly what Jake claimed to be, a soldier helping another soldier. The fact that Jake was calmly providing information and showing obvious concern for the guard's welfare probably worked in his favor. Why did you jump the barrier? Another security officer asked, his weapon still drawn but no longer pointed directly at Jake. Because he was falling, Jake said simply. Look at him. This isn't a prank or an attack. This is a medical emergency. That happened during your ceremony. As if to prove Jake's point, the guard in his arms stirred slightly and moaned softly. His eyes fluttered open briefly before closing again, but it was enough to show that he was alive and potentially responsive. The Australian family that had been standing next to Jake was pressed against the barrier, staring in shock. The father was still holding his camera, though he'd stopped taking pictures once he realized this wasn't part of the show. His wife was clutching their teenage daughter, who looked simultaneously terrified and fascinated by the drama unfolding in front of them. Step back, everyone step back. Police officers were shouting at the crowd, trying to create more space around the incident. But people weren't moving much. This was the most exciting thing most of them had ever seen in person, and everyone wanted to capture it on their phones. Jake could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on him, along with all those camera lenses. He realized that whatever happened next, this moment was being recorded by dozens of people and would probably end up on social media within minutes. His quiet London vacation had just become very, very public. The sirens were getting louder now, and Jake could see an ambulance pushing through the crowd in the distance. That was the best news he'd heard since this whole thing started. Professional medical help was almost here, which meant the guard would get proper treatment instead of just first aid from a concerned fellow soldier. Medical personnel coming through, someone shouted, and Jake felt a wave of relief wash over him. Soon this would be out of his hands and in the care of people who were actually trained and equipped to handle medical emergencies. But first, he still had to deal with the small army of security personnel surrounding him, all of whom were trying to figure out whether he was a hero or a threat. Put your hands where I can see them and step away from the guard. The command came from a tall officer with sergeant stripes who just pushed through the circle of security personnel. His weapon was drawn but pointed downward, though Jake could see his finger resting near the trigger. Jake kept his voice calm and steady, the way they'd taught him to speak during hostage negotiations training. I can't let go of him right now. If I do, he'll hit the pavement hard. This soldier needs medical help, not a security response. The unconscious guard in Jake's arms stirred slightly, letting out a soft groan that was barely audible over the crowd noise. His eyelids fluttered for a moment before closing again, but it was enough to show that he was still alive and potentially responsive. Sir, we have paramedics en route, another officer reported, speaking into his radio. ETA approximately 3 minutes. 3 minutes felt like an eternity when you were holding an unconscious person while surrounded by armed security. Jake could feel sweat starting to form on his own forehead, though whether it was from the physical strain of supporting the guard's weight or the stress of the situation, he couldn't tell. The crowd behind the barriers had grown even larger as word spread about the incident. People were pushing and shoving to get a better view, holding their phones high above their heads to record the drama. Jake could hear dozens of different languages being spoken as tourists tried to figure out what was happening. This is mental, he heard a British woman say to her companion. Is this some kind of terrorist attack? Doesn't look like it, her friend replied. That American bloke seems to be helping the guard, not hurting him. Jake almost smiled at that assessment, but the situation was still too tense for any humor. The security officers around him were trained professionals doing their jobs, but they were also dealing with something completely outside their normal protocols. A tourist jumping barriers during a royal ceremony wasn't exactly covered in their standard operating procedures. What's your full name and identification? The sergeant demanded, his eyes never leaving Jake's face. Staff Sergeant Jake Thompson, United States Marine Corps, serial number 2847395248116. Jake responded immediately, rattling off the information in the clipped military style that was second nature to him. My ID is in my back right pocket, along with my passport. One of the junior officers moved around behind Jake carefully, his movements slow and deliberate. I'm going to retrieve your identification, he announced. Don't make any sudden movements. Roger that, Jake replied, using military terminology without thinking about it. He felt the officer's hand carefully extract his wallet from his pocket, taking care not to jostle him while he was still supporting the injured guard. The senior sergeant examined Jake's military ID card closely, comparing the photo to Jake's face. After what felt like forever, he nodded to his colleagues. ID appears genuine. American military personnel, currently on leave status? Some of the tension in the circle seemed to ease slightly, though none of the officers relaxed their vigilance completely. Jake understood their caution in today's world. You couldn't be too careful about security, especially around high-profile targets like the royal family. The guard in Jake's arms was becoming slightly more responsive. His breathing was deeper now, and some color was returning to his cheeks. Whatever had caused him to collapse, the immediate crisis seemed to be passing. Jake adjusted his grip slightly, making sure the young man's airway remained clear. "How long has he been unconscious?" asked a new voice. Jake looked up to see a woman in a different uniform approaching, probably palace security rather than police. "About 2 minutes now," Jake estimated. He was showing signs of distress before he collapsed, sweating heavily, pale skin, unsteady on his feet. Classic symptoms of heat exhaustion or dehydration. The woman nodded, making notes on a small pad. "Have you had medical training?" "Basic combat medic training, yes ma'am. Nothing fancy, but enough to recognize when someone's in trouble." In the distance, Jake could hear sirens getting closer. The sound was music to his ears. Professional medical help was almost here. He'd done what he could, but the guard needed proper medical evaluation and treatment. "The ambulance is here." Someone called out from the crowd control perimeter. Jake looked up to see paramedics pushing through the mass of people, carrying their equipment bags and a portable stretcher. They moved with the efficient urgency of medical professionals who'd seen it all before. "Make way for medical," officers began shouting, creating a path through the crowd for the paramedics to reach them. The lead paramedic, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and steady hands, knelt down next to Jake and the guard. "What's the situation here?" Jake quickly summarized what he'd observed, using the medical terminology he'd learned during his combat training. The paramedic listened carefully while beginning his own assessment of the patient. "You can ease him down now," the paramedic instructed. "We've got him." Carefully, Jake helped lower the guard onto the stretcher that his partner had positioned nearby. As soon as the weight was off his arms, Jake felt a wave of relief wash over him. The immediate crisis was over, and the guard was now in professional hands. The young soldier's eyes opened fully for the first time since collapsing. He looked confused and disoriented, blinking rapidly as he tried to focus on the faces surrounding him. "Where The guard asked weakly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You collapsed during the ceremony," the paramedic explained, gently while checking his vital signs. "This gentleman caught you before you hit the ground. You're going to be fine, but we need to get you checked out properly." The guard's eyes found Jake's face in the crowd of officials surrounding him. You caught me?" Jake nodded. "Yeah, buddy, you were going down hard. Couldn't let a fellow soldier hit the deck like that." A small smile crossed the guard's pale face. "Thank you," he managed to say before the paramedics began preparing him for transport. As the medical team worked, the security officers around Jake began to relax slightly. The immediate threat assessment was clearly over, and it was becoming obvious that Jake was exactly what he claimed to be, a soldier who'd acted on instinct to help another soldier in distress. "We're going to need a full statement from you," the sergeant informed Jake. "This is going to require a complete investigation," Jake nodded, understanding the necessity. "Of course." "I'm staying at the Premier Inn near Victoria Station." "I'm not going anywhere." The crowd behind the barriers was still massive, with people continuing to take photos and videos of the aftermath. Jake realized that this moment was probably going to end up on social media around the world within hours. His quiet vacation had just become very, very public. "Sir, One of the younger officers approached hesitantly. The media are already asking questions. This is going to be a big story. The sergeant grimaced. That's above my pay grade. We'll let the higher-ups deal with the press. He turned back to Jake. For now, we need to get you somewhere secure where we can conduct a proper interview. Jake watched as the paramedics loaded the guard into the ambulance. The young man was sitting up now and talking to the medical team, which was a good sign. Whatever had caused his collapse, it didn't appear to be life-threatening. As the ambulance pulled away, Jake finally had a moment to process what had just happened. He'd come to London for a peaceful vacation, and instead, he'd just created what was probably going to be an international incident. The ride to Buckingham Palace's security office was unlike anything Jake had experienced in his military career. He sat in the back of an unmarked police vehicle, watching London streets pass by while trying to process what had just happened. The two officers in the front seat spoke quietly into their radios, using codes and terminology that Jake couldn't quite follow. "Never seen anything like that before," the driver commented to his partner. "American tourist jumping the barriers to help one of our guards. Media's going to have a field day with this one." Jake stared out the window, wondering if he'd made the right choice. In Afghanistan, helping a fellow soldier was automatic. You didn't think about protocols or consequences when someone was in trouble. But this wasn't a war zone, and the rules were clearly different here. The palace security entrance was nothing like the tourist areas Jake had seen earlier. Heavy gates, armed guards, and serious-looking people in suits who seemed to appear from nowhere. As their car pulled through the checkpoint, Jake felt like he was entering a completely different world. "First time inside the palace?" the officer in the passenger seat asked, glancing back at Jake. "Yeah, and probably the last," Jake replied with a weak smile. "Not exactly how I planned to see the sights." The officer almost smiled back. "Well, you've certainly seen them in a way most tourists never will." They were escorted through a maze of corridors that looked nothing like the fancy rooms tourists got to see. These were working areas with plain walls, fluorescent lighting, and the kind of practical furniture you'd find in any government building. Jake was led into a small conference room with a single table, 3 chairs, and a camera mounted in the corner. "Someone will be with you shortly," the officer said. Closing the door behind him, Jake sat alone for what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes. The silence gave him time to think about what he was going to say, how he was going to explain his actions to people who might not understand the military mindset that had driven him to act. When the door finally opened, 3 people walked in. A woman in a business suit who looked like she could be a lawyer, a man in military uniform with more ribbons on his chest than Jake had ever seen, and another person in plain clothes who had the unmistakable bearing of law enforcement. "Staff." "Sergeant Thompson," the military officer began, settling into the chair across from Jake. "I'm Colonel Williams, and this is Detective Inspector Harris and Miss Patterson from the Palace legal team. We need to understand exactly what happened out there today." Jake straightened up automatically, his military training kicking in when faced with senior officers. "Yes, sir, I'm happy to answer any questions you have." The detective pulled out a recording device and placed it on the table. "This conversation is being recorded for the official investigation. Are you comfortable proceeding without legal representation?" "I don't need a lawyer," Jake said immediately. "I helped a soldier who was in medical distress. I'd do the same thing again if I had to." Miss Patterson made a note on her pad. "Let's start from the beginning. What brought you to the ceremony today?" Jake told them about his leave, his sister's postcards, his decision to see the changing of the guard ceremony as a tourist. He described standing in the crowd, watching the guards, noticing something was wrong with one of them. "When did you first realize there was a problem?" Colonel Williams asked. "The guard was sweating heavily despite the cool weather," Jake explained. "His face was pale, and I could see him struggling to maintain his position. I've seen heat casualties before during training." The signs were obvious to anyone with military experience. Detective Inspector Harris leaned forward. "Why didn't you alert security instead of taking action yourself?" Jake had been expecting this question. Sir, there wasn't time. The guard was going down fast, and I was the closest person who could help. By the time I could have gotten someone's attention and explained the situation, he would have been unconscious on the concrete. But you must have known that jumping. Those barriers would create a security incident, Miss Patterson pointed out. Yes, ma'am, I did, Jake admitted. But I also knew that if I didn't act, a fellow soldier was going to get seriously hurt. In my mind, that made the choice pretty simple. Colonel. Williams studied Jake carefully. You served in Afghanistan, according to your records. How many deployments? 2 tours, sir. 15 months total combat time. Ever have to make split-second decisions about helping wounded personnel? Jake met the colonel's eyes. More times than I'd like to remember, sir. The colonel nodded slowly. I see. And in those situations, did you stop to think about protocols and procedures, or did you act on training and instinct? Instinct, sir. When someone's life is on the line, you don't have the luxury of checking the manual. The room fell silent. For a moment, Jake could tell the 3 investigators were trying to figure out how to handle a situation that probably wasn't covered in any of their standard procedures. A foreign military person creating a security breach in order to provide medical assistance was likely a first for all of them. Detective Inspector Harris spoke up. We've reviewed the CCTV footage from multiple angles. Your actions appear to be exactly as you've described them. The guard was clearly in distress, and your intervention prevented what could have been a serious injury. Miss Patterson consulted her notes. The medical team confirmed that Private Collins was suffering from severe dehydration and early-stage heat exhaustion. Without intervention, he could have sustained a concussion or worse from hitting the pavement. Jake felt a wave of relief wash over him. How is he doing now, Private Collins? He's been treated and released, Colonel Williams said. Full recovery expected. He asked us to pass along his thanks. The problem we're facing, Detective Inspector Harris continued, is that regardless of your intentions, you did breach Royal security protocols. There are procedures in place for a reason. Jake nodded. I understand that, sir. I'm not trying to minimize what I did. I just want you to understand why I did it. Miss Patterson looked up from her legal pad. The challenge is that this incident has already attracted significant media attention. Videos of what happened are circulating on social media, and news outlets are picking up the story. How significant? Jake asked, though he was afraid he already knew the answer. The hashtag American Hero is trending on Twitter, she replied. BBC News is calling it an unprecedented breach of royal protocol. CNN is running with U.S. Marine saves British Guard. This isn't going to be a quiet story. Jake rubbed his forehead. Great, my commanding officer is going to love this. Colonel Williams almost smiled. Actually, we've already been in contact with your chain of command. Your unit commander spoke very highly of your character and service record. That's something at least, Jake muttered. The detective closed his notebook. Here's where we stand. Technically, you committed several violations of the Public Order Act and various security regulations. However, the circumstances were extraordinary, your intentions were clearly benevolent, and the outcome was positive. Miss Patterson took over. The Palace legal team has been discussing this with senior officials. Given the unique nature of the situation and the positive outcome, we're not planning to pursue criminal charges. Jake felt like a massive weight had been lifted off his shoulders. Thank you, I really appreciate that. However, Colonel Williams added, this incident has created some diplomatic complications that need to be addressed at higher levels. Jake looked confused. Diplomatic complications? When a foreign military person breaches security at a royal ceremony, it requires formal discussions between governments, Miss Patterson explained. Nothing serious, but paperwork needs to be filed, reports need to be written, and protocols need to be reviewed. The detective stood up. For now, you're free to continue your vacation. We may need to contact you for follow-up questions, but the immediate investigation is complete. As Jake prepared to leave, Colonel Williams handed him a business card. Staff Sergeant, what you did today showed the kind of character and instincts that make good soldiers. Don't second-guess yourself. walking out of Buckingham Palace through the same gates he'd entered as a suspected security threat. Jake felt like he'd lived through several lifetimes in just a few hours. His quiet London. Vacation had become anything but quiet, and he had a feeling the complications were just beginning. Jake stepped out of the palace gates and immediately realized his life had changed completely. A wall of reporters and camera crews was waiting for him, their equipment pointed in his direction like weapons. The crowd of journalists surged forward. As soon as they spotted him, shouting questions and pushing microphones toward his face, "Staff Sergeant Thompson, how does it feel to be called a hero? Did you think about the security risk when you jumped that barrier? What was going through your mind when you saw the guard collapse?" Jake stopped dead in his tracks, overwhelmed by the chaos. He'd been in firefights that felt less intense than this media ambush. Cameras flashed constantly, creating a strobing effect that made everything feel surreal and disorienting. Jake started to speak, then realized he had no idea what to say. The palace legal team hadn't prepared him for this part of the aftermath. A reporter from Sky News pushed closer. "The video of your rescue has been viewed over 2 million times already. Did you expect this kind of response? 2 million times?" Jake's head spun. He'd been inside the palace for less than 3 hours, and somehow his moment of helping another soldier had become international news. His phone, which had been turned off during the investigation, probably had hundreds of missed calls and messages. "Look, I just helped someone who needed help," Jake managed to say, his voice barely carrying over the noise of the crowd. "Any soldier would have done the same thing." "But you're not just any soldier," called out a reporter from the BBC. "You're an American Marine who breached royal security to save a British guard. That's unprecedented." Jake felt trapped. The crowd of reporters was growing larger by the minute, and more people were arriving with cameras and equipment. He could see curious tourists gathering at the edges of the media scrum, trying to figure out what all the excitement was about. A woman from CNN stepped forward with her microphone. "There are reports that you could have faced serious criminal charges. How do you respond to critics who say you created an unnecessary security risk?" "I don't know anything about critics," Jake replied, his frustration starting to show. "All I know is that a fellow soldier was in trouble, and I was in a position to help. I'd make the same choice again." His phone started buzzing in his pocket. Even though it was turned off, somehow messages were still getting through. Jake pulled it out and saw dozens of missed calls from numbers he didn't recognize, along with text messages from friends, family, and even people from his unit back home. One message from his sister read, "Jake, you're all over the news. Mama is crying happy tears. Call me." Another from his commanding officer said, "Thompson, call me ASAP. Media requests are flooding the base." Jake realized he needed to get away from this crowd before things got completely out of hand. He looked around for an escape route, but the reporters had effectively surrounded him. Every direction he turned, there were more cameras and microphones. "Waiting. Excuse me, I need to get through," Jake said, trying to push gently through the crowd. "Just one more question." Multiple reporters called out at once. A photographer from Reuters stepped directly into Jake's path. "Can we get a photo of you in front of the palace? This is going to be front-page news around the world." Front-page news? Jake felt like he was living in some kind of alternate reality. This morning he'd been a tourist looking forward to a quiet day of sightseeing. Now he was apparently international news, and all he'd done was help someone who needed help. His phone rang, and Jake saw his sister's number on the screen. He answered it without thinking, desperate for a familiar voice in all this chaos. "Jake, oh my God, are you okay?" His sister's voice came through clearly despite the noise around him. "I'm fine, but I'm kind of in the middle of something here," Jake said, ducking away from a camera that was trying to film his phone conversation. "The whole family is watching the news. Dad recorded it on his phone and keeps showing it to everyone." "You're famous." Famous was not something Jake had ever wanted to be. He'd chosen military service partly because he liked the idea of serving quietly, doing his duty without seeking attention or recognition. "Look, I can't really talk right now," Jake said, watching more media vehicles pull up to the palace area. I'll call you back when I can find somewhere quiet. The reporters are calling here too, his sister warned him. They want to interview the family about what kind of person you are. Jake groaned. His family was being dragged into this mess now too. His parents were quiet people who valued their privacy. Having news crews show up at their house was probably their worst nightmare. A reporter from The Guardian managed to get close enough to overhear part of Jake's phone conversation. Was that your family? How are they handling your sudden fame? Jake hung up and glared at the reporter. This is a private phone call. Can you give me some space here? The public has a right to know about the hero who saved the day, the reporter replied, not backing down. I'm not a hero, Jake said firmly. I'm just a soldier who helped another soldier. That's what we do. But the reporters weren't buying his modest response. They seemed determined to turn him into some kind of international symbol. Whether he wanted that role or not, a van from ITV News pulled up, and Jake watched in horror as even more reporters climbed out with their equipment. This situation was spiraling completely out of control, and he had no idea how to handle it. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Jake, this is Private Collins, the guard you helped. The media found my contact info too. Want to meet up somewhere away from all this craziness? Jake typed back quickly, yes. Where? There's a pub called the Duke of Wellington about 6 blocks from the palace, back entrance. 20 minutes? On my way, Jake replied, grateful for any escape from this media circus. Jake put his phone away and looked around at the crowd of reporters. He needed to get out of here, but they weren't showing any signs of letting him go easily. Look, everyone, Jake announced, raising his voice to be heard over the chaos. I appreciate your interest, but I really need some time to process all this. I'll talk to the media later, but right now I just need some space. When later? Several reporters called. Out at once. I don't know yet, Jake replied honestly. This is all pretty overwhelming. He started walking toward the street, and the crowd of reporters followed him like a pack. Cameras continued flashing, and microphones stayed pointed in his direction. Jake felt like he was being hunted by a very polite but persistent mob. A taxi was stopped at a red light nearby, and Jake seized his opportunity. He jogged over and knocked on the window. Can you take me somewhere? He asked the driver. The cabbie looked at Jake, then at the crowd of reporters chasing after him, and grinned. Get in, mate. Looks like you could use a ride. Jake dove into the back seat just as the light turned green. As the taxi pulled away, he could see the reporters in the rear window, some of them actually running after the car with their cameras still rolling. Rough day? The taxi driver asked, glancing at Jake in the rearview mirror. You could say that, Jake replied, slumping back in his seat. And I have a feeling it's just getting started. The Duke of Wellington pub was exactly what Jake needed after the chaos outside the palace. Dark wood, dim lighting, and the kind of quiet atmosphere where a person could think without cameras flashing in their face. He found Private Collins, sitting in a corner booth, still looking pale, but much better than when Jake had last seen him on a stretcher. You look like you've been through a war, Collins said with a weak smile as Jake slid into the seat across from him. Feels like it, Jake replied, running his hands through his hair. I've faced enemy fire that was less stressful than that media crowd. How are you holding up? Collins lifted his pint glass slightly. Doctor said I need to stay hydrated. Figured this was as good a way as any. He took a small sip and set it down carefully. Been getting calls from reporters all day. My mum's phone hasn't stopped ringing either? Jake shook his head. This is insane. All I did was catch you when you fell. Since when does that make international news? Since an American Marine jumped the barriers at Buckingham Palace to save a royal guard, Collins pointed out. That's not exactly something that happens every day. A waitress approached their table, and Jake ordered a coffee. His hands were still shaking slightly from the adrenaline of escaping the media mob. The caffeine probably wouldn't help, but he needed something normal to ground himself. The weird part is, Collins continued, I don't even remember most of what happened. 1 minute I was standing at attention during the ceremony, and the next thing I knew, I was waking up in an ambulance with paramedics asking me questions. You were in bad shape? Jake told him. Classic heat exhaustion symptoms. How long had you been feeling unwell? Collins looked embarrassed. Probably about an hour before I went down. Started feeling dizzy and nauseous, but you don't just leave your post during a royal ceremony. That's not how it works. Jake understood that mentality completely. Military discipline meant pushing through discomfort and completing your mission, even when your body was telling you to stop. But sometimes that mindset could be dangerous. Have you eaten anything today? Jake asked. Not much, Collins admitted. Had some toast for breakfast, but I was too nervous about the ceremony to eat lunch. Been doing these ceremonies for 2 years, but I still get anxious before the big public ones. Jake's phone buzzed with yet another text message. He glanced at it and saw it was from his commanding officer back in California. The message was brief but concerning. Call me immediately. Situation developing. Everything okay? Collins asked, noticing Jake's worried expression. I don't know yet, Jake replied, dialing his CO's number. The call connected after just one ring. Thompson, where the hell are you? His commanding officer's voice came through the phone. London, sir, in a pub with the guard I helped. Is there a problem? Problem? Son, the Secretary of Defense's office has been calling about you. The British Embassy wants to talk to you. And somehow my phone number ended up on the internet, so I've been getting calls from reporters in 12 different countries. Jake felt his stomach drop. Sir, I can explain. There's nothing to explain, Thompson. What you did was exemplary. But you've created a diplomatic situation that's way above both our pay grades. Collins was watching Jake's face carefully, clearly understanding that this conversation wasn't going well. What kind of diplomatic situation, sir? Jake asked. The kind where governments have to issue official statements. The British Prime Minister mentioned the incident in Parliament today. The President's press secretary fielded questions about it during the daily briefing. This isn't just military news anymore, Thompson. This is international politics. Jake closed his eyes. All I did was help someone who needed help. I know that, and you know that, but the world sees it differently. You've become a symbol of Anglo-American cooperation, whether you like it or not. The waitress brought Jake's coffee, but he barely noticed. The enormity of what was happening was starting to sink in. His simple act of helping a fellow soldier had somehow turned into a major international story with diplomatic implications. Sir, what am I supposed to do? For now, keep your head down and don't talk to any more reporters. We're working on getting you some proper media training and maybe a public affairs officer to help handle this situation. Media training? Jake repeated, feeling overwhelmed. Thompson, like it or not, you're going to be in the spotlight for a while. We need to make sure you're prepared for that. Jake hung up and stared at his coffee cup. Across the table, Collins was watching him with sympathy. Sounds like you're dealing with the same kind of circus I am, Collins said. Apparently worse, Jake replied. My CO says this has become some kind of diplomatic thing between countries. Collins nodded. Makes sense, actually. The royal family takes these ceremonies very seriously. When something like this happens, it gets attention at the highest levels. Jake's phone rang again. This time it was an unknown international number. He let it go to voicemail, but within seconds it was ringing again with a different unknown number. You might want to turn that off, Collins suggested. I made that mistake earlier. Ended up talking to a reporter from Australia who somehow got my personal number. Jake switched his phone to silent mode, but he could see the screen lighting up constantly with new calls and messages. The attention was relentless and overwhelming. The crazy thing is, Collins said, taking another small sip of his drink, my commanding officers aren't upset about what happened. They're actually pretty impressed that an American soldier cared enough to help. Really? Yeah, Colonel Peterson pulled me aside after I got out of the medical center. Said it showed the kind of military brotherhood that makes the alliance between. Our country's strong? Collins paused. He also said the palace wants to do something official to recognize what you did. Jake looked up sharply. What kind of something official? Don't know the details yet. But apparently, when a foreign military person shows exceptional character during a royal ceremony, there are protocols for that kind of thing. Jake felt a mix of pride and anxiety. Recognition from the British military would be an honor, but it would also mean more attention, more ceremonies, and probably more media coverage. I just wanted to see the sights and maybe visit a few museums, Jake said with a rueful laugh. This was supposed to be a quiet vacation, Collins smiled. Well, you've definitely seen the sights, and you've made some history in the process. Man in a business suit approached their table cautiously. Jake tensed, expecting another reporter, but the man's bearing suggested something different. Excuse me, the man said politely. Are you Staff Sergeant Thompson? Depends who's asking, Jake replied carefully. The man pulled out an official-looking envelope with royal seals. I'm from the private secretary's office at Buckingham Palace. I have a message for you. Jake took the envelope with trembling hands. The heavy paper and formal wax seal made it clear this was something important and official. What does it say? Collins asked as Jake opened it carefully. Jake read the formal language twice before the meaning sank in. It's an invitation, he sighed quietly. They want me to come back to the palace tomorrow for some kind of private ceremony. Collins raised his eyebrows. Blimey, that's not something that happens every day. Jake stared at the invitation, realizing that his unexpected adventure in London was far from over. If anything, the most significant part was just beginning. Jake stood outside Buckingham Palace the next morning, wearing the only decent clothes he'd packed for his vacation, a simple button-down shirt and dark slacks. The media circus from the day before had calmed down slightly, though he could still see news vans parked across the street and photographers with long telephoto lenses trying to get shots of him approaching the gates. This time, however, he wasn't jumping barriers. Palace guards in dress uniforms escorted him through the same entrance he'd been taken to the day before for questioning, but today felt completely different. Instead of being treated as a potential security threat, he was being welcomed as an honored guest. Nervous? Asked Captain Reynolds, the palace liaison officer who was walking beside him through the elegant corridors. A little, Jake admitted, taking in the ornate decorations and historical paintings that lined the walls. I've never been inside a real palace before. Well, except for yesterday, but that was different, Captain Reynolds smiled. Today's ceremony is quite rare, actually. We don't often have occasions to formally recognize foreign military personnel for actions taken during royal duties. They walked through corridors that Jake was sure tourists would pay hundreds of dollars to see. Crystal chandeliers hung from decorated ceilings, and portraits of kings and queens from centuries past watched their progress. It was the kind of place that made you whisper without thinking about it. How's Private Collins doing? Jake asked. As they turned down another hallway, much better. He'll be joining us today, actually. The medical team cleared him for light duties, and he specifically requested to be present for your recognition. Jake felt relieved to hear that. He'd been worried about the young guard ever since their conversation at the pub. Dehydration and heat exhaustion weren't usually serious if caught early, but they could be dangerous if left untreated. They entered a medium-sized room that was formal but not overwhelming. Unlike the grand throne rooms Jake had seen in movies, this space felt more like an elegant office where important business could be conducted without unnecessary ceremony. Several people in military uniforms and business suits were already present, including Private Collins, who looked much healthier than he had the day before. Staff Sergeant Thompson, Collins said, standing and extending his hand. Good to see you again under better circumstances? Likewise, Jake replied, shaking the guard's hand firmly. How are you feeling? Like an idiot for not eating properly before a ceremony, Collins replied with a self-deprecating grin. Physically, I'm fine. Doctor says I should be back to full duties within a few days. A distinguished woman in military uniform approached them. Staff Sergeant Thompson, I'm General Morrison, commanding officer of the Household Division. Thank you for coming today. Jake straightened automatically when addressed by a general. Ma'am, thank you for inviting me. I have to say I never expected anything like this. What you did yesterday was extraordinary, General Morrison continued. Not just the physical act of helping Private Collins, but the split-second decision to put another soldier's welfare above your own safety and legal concerns. Ma'am, any soldier would have done the same thing, Jake replied, though he was starting to realize that maybe that wasn't entirely true. Actually, that's exactly the point, said another voice from across the room. Jake turned to see a man in civilian clothes approaching. I'm Ambassador Harrison, the American ambassador to the United Kingdom. What you demonstrated yesterday was the kind of military professionalism and human compassion that exemplifies the best of our alliance. Jake felt overwhelmed by all the high-ranking officials treating him like some kind of hero. Sir, I appreciate that, but I really just acted on instinct. Sometimes instinct reveals character better than any planned action, Ambassador Harrison replied. Your instincts were to help a fellow soldier in distress, regardless of nationality or personal consequences. Captain Reynolds stepped forward. If everyone's ready, we'd like to begin the ceremony. They moved to the center of the room, where Jake found himself standing next to Private Collins while the various officials arranged themselves in a semicircle around them. Jake noticed a photographer in the corner, but thankfully just one, and he seemed to be taking discreet shots rather than the aggressive paparazzi-style photos from the day before. General Morrison began speaking in formal tones that carried the weight of military tradition. Yesterday, during the changing of the guard ceremony at Buckingham Palace, an extraordinary act of military brotherhood took place. Staff Sergeant Jake Thompson of the United States Marine Corps, while visiting London as a tourist, observed that Private Collins of the Coldstream Guards was experiencing medical distress. Jake listened as the general recounted the events, making them sound more heroic and significant than Jake remembered them feeling at the time. Without regard for his own safety or the potential legal consequences, Staff Sergeant Thompson immediately acted to prevent serious injury to a fellow serviceman. His actions exemplify the highest traditions of military service and the strong bonds between allied forces. Private Collins stepped forward slightly. Sir, I'd like to say something, if I may. General Morrison nodded. Collins turned to face Jake directly. Yesterday I was about to fall face first onto stone pavement while carrying a loaded rifle. I could have been seriously injured, or worse, someone in the crowd could have been hurt if my weapon had discharged. Staff Sergeant Thompson prevented all of that from happening. Jake felt his face getting warm with embarrassment. This level of formal recognition felt excessive for what had been an automatic response to seeing someone in trouble. Furthermore, Collins continued, his actions have led to important changes in our protocols. We're implementing new hydration requirements and medical monitoring procedures for all ceremonial duties. Other soldiers will be safer because of what happened yesterday. That got Jake's attention. He hadn't realized that his intervention might lead to systematic improvements that could help other guards in the future. Ambassador Harrison stepped forward with an official-looking certificate. Staff Sergeant Thompson, on behalf of the United States government and in recognition of your exemplary conduct while representing American values abroad, I'm pleased to present you with this certificate of appreciation for distinguished service. Jake accepted the certificate, reading the formal language that described his selfless action in the finest traditions of American military service. It was signed by officials he'd only seen on television. General Morrison then presented him with a British military commendation. This is from the Household Division, recognizing your assistance to one of our soldiers and your demonstration of the military brotherhood that strengthens our alliance. As the ceremony concluded, Jake found himself holding two official recognitions for what had felt like the most natural thing in the world to do. The formal language and military pageantry were impressive, but what meant more to him was the genuine gratitude he saw in Private Collins' eyes. You know, Collins said quietly, as the officials began to disperse, this whole thing has been mental, but I'm glad it happened. Even though you ended up unconscious and in an ambulance? Jake asked. Especially because of that, Collins replied. I learned that when soldiers are in trouble, it doesn't matter what country they're from or what uniform they're wearing. Someone will step up to help. Jake thought about that as they prepared to leave. The past 2 days had been overwhelming, confusing, and completely unlike anything he'd expected from his London vacation. But Collins was right about one thing it had revealed. Something important about the bonds between people who served Dawes as they walked back through the palace corridors. Jake realized this experience would follow him for the rest of his military career, not because of the media attention or the official recognition, but because it had reminded him why he'd chosen to serve in the first place, to protect and help others, whether they were fellow Americans or allies from across the ocean. His quiet vacation had become anything but quiet, but maybe that wasn't such a bad thing after all.